With all the focus on the May Trump meeting, I'm in quite a political mood. I've been looking over the past hour at interviews with presidents, prime ministers. Um, I just find it very interesting, really, to see these historical archives and to see what someone's position was at a particular time, how they interpreted something, perhaps how they look back on something at different times. So, yeah, I'm just in a political mood. And in the spirit of that, I want to discuss some differences between the UK and the US system. I was thinking about this at the time of Trump's election victory because there was, of course, that 90-day transition period. And that's going to be my sort of starting point to point out the differences. Of course, the similarities. Both countries are democracies. Both countries are uh, liberal democracies in the sense of believing in the same values, freedom of expression, etc., etc. Um, So there's certainly similarities, but there are some marked differences. Now, the most obvious is that the United States is a presidential republic, whereas the United Kingdom is a parliamentary system. So the most the starting point I would start off with is that our head of state is the Queen, whereas the head of state in the United States is the president, who's also elected. Now, the Queen, of course, is not elected. There are some monarchies in the world that are actually elected. I believe Malaysia is one of them. The United Kingdom is not. Now, support for the monarchy in the UK is currently about 70%. There is a minority, but quite a vocal minority of Republicans who want to disestablish the monarchy. Personally, I find it hard to see this country as a republic. However, I do respect their opinion. And it's important to remember that Britain is not Thailand. We can criticise the monarchy openly. There's no problem with that. Also, for my American viewers, Britain today is very different than it was in 1776. Um, Slight bit of context about King George III. He was going through mental illness at the time, and he was going through porphyria. But even when George III was king, and this is a not so well known stateside, the Glorious Revolution had already happened in the 1680s, so technically, George was not an absolute monarch. I appreciate from the American perspective, he would certainly seem that way. But actually, it was the British Parliament more than George himself that was in division about the rights of man and the sort of ideals of that time, which of course triggered the American Revolution. Anyway, our two countries are closely related. And there's no way around that. There's shared history going back to the Pilgrim Fathers, shared language. Um, our histories are interconnected, even though there's a sizable distance, 3,000 miles of the Atlantic. There is that shared history. Not far from where I live is Washington Old Hall, and I might be going off on a tangent here, but I think it's relevant. And basically, it's the ancestral home of George Washington. Washington himself was born in Virginia, but his ancestors probably were going back 3 or 4 generations, were born in Northamptonshire, which is in the sort of English Midlands. However, some of them before that lived in Washington, which is about 10 miles from here. So we do have that American connection, and every July the 4th, there's some events take place there for that occasion. So we always call it the original Washington. Within 20 miles of where I live, there's a Philadelphia, a New York. So the American connections are all around here. Also, I'm originally from Northern Ireland. Several presidents, including Chester Arthur and Andrew Jackson, have origins there. And I know every president says they've got Irish connections, but with these two, there really is direct connections. Um, so there are links there. There are cultural links there, but we have not. We never had a French Revolution. We did experiment with republicanism for a brief period from 16, let me get this right, 1649 to 1661, which is known as the interregnum, when Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector, although some would say he liked to really see himself as King Oliver I. But essentially, he was our first and only president. Um, by the standards of the time, he was no better or no worse than other autocratic leaders around, although today's very much seen as a dictator, especially in Ireland. Anyway, there have been 44 American presidencies, 45 presidencies, 44 individuals. That's something that sometimes is misinterpreted because actually, although Trump is the 45th president, technically he's only the 44th person in the office. In Britain, we have 54, but the office of Prime Minister and President is somewhat different. The office of President was specifically created from the Constitution, and George Washington himself decided to use the term as President. Very simple, no frills, which was Washington's way of showing he was a man of the people. He didn't want Your Excellency or anything like that. With the Prime Ministership, it actually developed by accident. It was never an office specifically set up. We generally see the first Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, beginning roughly in 1721. Before that, there was two offices called the Northern Secretary and the Southern Secretary, a bit complicated. And then going way back to the Middle Ages, there was positions like the Lord High Chancellor, the Lord Advocate, who were usually clergy, and they were essentially the Prime Minister. Um, but getting into the 18th century, when we started to drive more towards parliamentary democracy, certainly not comparable to today. It was very corrupt. Certainly there was not universal male suffrage, never mind female suffrage. So it was a very different time. But generally, we see Walpole as the first prime minister simply because he took control of the cabinet. There was actually another man, Lord Carteret, who was actually the leader of the cabinet in a sense, but it was Walpole that had the real dominance. So we see Walpole as the first prime minister, give or take. And since then, there have been 54 people have filled that position, 52 men and 2 women. Um, and in that time, we have, like the American system, had a pretty smooth transition of power. There has never been a violent power struggle between two prime ministers in this country, as there has never been a violent power struggle between two American presidents. So again, that's something that we have in common, that peaceful transition. Now, like I said, the office of Prime Minister was never really formalised. In fact, we didn't formalise the term until 1905 under Henry Campbell Bannerman. Before that, even in the Victorian period, the formal title was the Lord of the Treasury. So that really came about by accident, whereas the presidency was always a set office. Another thing about the presidency, in some ways, is a lot smoother because with various amendments of the Constitution, a president can serve only a maximum of 8 terms. Of course, Roosevelt done over, I think he just went into his 4th term when he died, and then the constitution had to be changed because of concerns that he was becoming too dominant. In the UK, a prime minister can, in theory, be in office as long as they win elections. So our longest serving prime minister was Walpole for about 23 years, 22, 23 years, followed by William Pitt the Younger, 19 years. Interestingly, Pitt was only in his 40s when he died. He became prime minister at the age of 24, which is astonishing. Um, so a long time, far longer even than Roosevelt. By contrast, our shortest serving prime minister was George Canning, who was in office for just 119 days. So there's a huge variation there. The average tenure of a British prime minister is probably between 4 and 6 years. That would be average. Um, Cameron was 6 years, so that's about an average sort of length in office. Um, and with the American system, it's either 4 years or 8 years if they win a re-election. There's only a few American presidents who have went outside those boundaries, either because they died in office in their 2nd term or their 1st term, or they filled in the remainder of an office of the predecessor, such as the case with Gerald Ford, and then went on to lose an election, or they chose not to run. So there are some who fit into that category. I believe one thing that is interesting is the last 3 presidents, American presidents, Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama, they're the first 3 consecutive presidents to win 2 terms since Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe almost 200 years ago. In other words, that whole time in between was either one-term presidents or one-off two-term presidents. So it's interesting to look at that. There was a period in the early 19th century was a long line of one-term presidents. Then Lincoln came along, he won re-election, and of course was assassinated. On the issue of assassination, because of course that has a big influence on how these things happen, there's obviously been four American presidents who've been assassinated at least. There is some speculation that Warren G. Harding was poisoned, but that is just speculation. But nevertheless, four is quite a large number for any country. That was, of course, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy. In the case of the Lincoln Kennedy assassinations, they were very high profile. Um, but even Garfield and McKinley, with Garfield, that actually brought about the invention of the X-ray in order to find the bullet. Now, in Britain, we've only had one Prime Ministerial assassination, and that was of Spencer Perceval. He was a Conservative Prime Minister from 1809 to 1812, not very long in office. He's certainly not one of our better known Prime Ministers, um, but he was assassinated by a man who was basically disgruntled that the Prime Minister hadn't helped him get government positions. Somewhat similar, actually, to the guy that assassinated Garfield, similar grievances. And he shot Percival in the lobby of the House of Commons. This is an event that, in the public mind, has somewhat been forgotten. So it's really only historians and history enthusiasts like myself who know about this, which is interesting. Um, but what happened on that occasion was, firstly, we never had deputy prime ministers. That was never an office that was specifically established. Some prime ministers choose to have a deputy, others don't. So Theresa May has no deputy in that sense. So there was no protocol for who took over. Actually, what happened was for about a month, from Percival's assassination to the new Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, taking over, we had no Prime Minister. And what happened was Liverpool won the leadership of his party, and he became Prime Minister in the general election. And this was, of course, before the time of the Great Reform Act, which meant that it wasn't, true democracy in that sense. The United States, likewise, has had a transition to democracy, and there was Jacksonian democracy, and that was a process. With uh, with the United Kingdom, the slavery issue was never such an issue here because we abolished slavery long before the United States did. But with Britain, it was a case of corruption, rotten boroughs. For example, you could have, let's say, three MPs representing a rural area, and yet only one MP representing a large industrial city. So the representation just wasn't equal. Anyway, so the evolution has been different with the presidency. There was always a protocol if a president was assassinated, starting with Lincoln. Then that was Andrew Johnson, of course, and so on. Now, another thing that is different is that in the United States, there's a sort of role of what's it called line of succession. In Britain, we again don't have that strictly adhered to. Generally speaking, the second most powerful position in government is seen to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister. In recent years, especially, they have come to be very important. So they are the minister most focused on after the Prime Minister. In third would be probably the Home Secretary, then the Foreign Secretary. Home Secretary is the equivalent of the Secretary of the Interior, I believe, or the Secretary for Homeland Security. In Britain, it's a very important role. That's a person who deals with terrorism, crime. Theresa May was in that position before she became Prime Minister for 6 years, which was quite a long time. Um, so after that, it's a toss-up between Defence Secretary, the Lord Chancellor, which is a historic role, possibly Attorney General, possibly the Leader of the House of Commons. So it's a bit of a toss-up. But generally, those four offices, Prime Minister, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, are the most important. In the United States, as I understand it, it's President, Vice President, Secretary of State, and I believe fourth is either Defence or the Leader of the House. In fact, Leader of the House might be the House Speaker might be third, and then Secretary of State. I can't remember the order. So in Britain, it's not quite as strictly adhered to in the United States. I think it is, but it's extremely unlikely that the first three people would be in that situation to be to die. Actually, in Britain with the royal family, apparently there's a protocol that at no one time will every member of the royal family be in one location. Let's say, for example, there was a major terrorist attack on their plane or on their special train or whatever it would be. Then the entire British royal family would be wiped out. So apparently, we have a situation. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but whereby they're never all in one place at one time. Um, in Britain, the Queen is head of state, but she has limited political power now. Republicans would contend that that's not the case. What usually happens? So this is basically how someone becomes prime minister in this country. Unlike the American system, where a political party chooses their nominee and then the public choose the president directly, in Britain we don't choose the prime minister directly. We vote for the party. So every 4 or 5 years, we now have fixed term parliaments. So it's 5 years. We have a general election to decide government. And the way it works is the leader of the big parties will all campaign, try and get the party as many seats as possible. There's a total of 650 seats. Try and think of that as number of senators in the House, um, in the Senate, I should say. Um, so 650 in total. A party has to get 327 or more in order to form a government. In the situation where no party gets that amount, we have a hung parliament, which is rare, but it does happen. It happened in 2010 when David Cameron's Conservatives had to go into coalition talks with the Liberal Democrats. A Prime Minister can choose to have a minority government, but it's usually not a good idea because what will happen is the opposition parties will get together and vote against everything. So 327 is that number to get a majority government. In our last election, Cameron just managed to get that. So this is a majority government, albeit a relatively small one. On other occasions, prime ministers have got very big majorities. Tony Blair in 1997 being an example. Clement Attlee in 1945, another example. Anyway, um, what would then happen is if they are the incumbent prime minister, they simply continue being prime minister. If they are the leader of the opposition, as in most cases they will be, because realistically the next biggest party is most realistically going to get those number of seats if they have a chance. The leader of that party will then have the right to become prime minister. So, for the sake of argument, the current leader of the opposition is Jeremy Corbyn. Um, if, in the chance his party, the Labour Party, gets the most seats in 2020, Jeremy Corbyn would have the right to become prime minister. It's a long shot right now, but I'm going to try and stay out of partisan politics for this video. Um, and then there's a formality where they go to meet the Queen. They say, Your Majesty, my party has won the largest majority. And then the Queen invites them to form a government. This is really a formality. The Queen is never going to refuse. The only time I think that would be the situation is in an extreme case. If you had like an outright fascist or an outright communist who is threatening to ban other political parties, that would then create a constitutional crisis and the Queen would probably be pressured to get involved. But it is extremely unlikely. Like I say, one thing, and I think to be honest, British people take this for granted, we do have very smooth politics in this country, which can even seem quite boring to other countries simply because it is so peaceful. Certainly, there's heated debates, and occasionally there can be scuffles in constituencies, but it's very rare. Um, and that's comparable to the American system. Again, the American system can be raucous. There could be barbed language on both sides, but it's rarely actually violent. So I'm going to finish on the point of the transition. With the American system, the nominee of a party, if they have won enough states in the electoral college, um, again, like the American system, in Britain it isn't by the popular vote, but by the number of seats. In the United States, it's not by the popular votes, but by the number of electoral college votes. Both systems arguably maybe need some reform in that area, but that's a matter for debate. Anyway, and we have had that debate. We've had referendums on this. Anyway, the transition period in the United States is some 90 days. George Bush complained that he only had 60 days. Well, they should try being in the position of a British Prime Minister because it is literally all done within a day. So there's a general election. We will know who has won the election, roughly, usually by lunchtime the next day. By the time all the seats get read out, my constituency is actually the very first in the country. So, in a sense, I live in the Iowa of the UK. But anyway, what will happen then is the leader with the biggest party has a right to go to the palace and form the next government. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister who's been defeated will be saying goodbye to their staff. They'll make their farewell address to the press just outside Downing Street, and the whole thing is done. The removal van comes in, it goes out. There's virtually no transition period. Now, I've always wondered about this. If there's a close election, I don't know how a Prime Minister or his family will know whether to actually pack their things or not. It's something I've never quite understood. It all seems a bit messy, so in my opinion, we maybe do need a transition period. Now, of course, the Prime Minister isn't the head of state, so we would never have a full inauguration American style. But I think there should be some ceremony other than the kissing of the hands of the monarch, just for that transition period, because to me it just seems very rushed. Just 1 week, something like that. That's just my instinct. There might well be reasons why it is the way it is at present, but that is one notable difference. Anyway, I've spoken at length here, but that is some differences between the British and American systems. There's aspects of both systems I like and dislike. I like in the American system that there is a transition period. I think that's important. Also, the whole style of debates, we've actually recently adopted that, televised debates. Um, One thing I'm not a fan of in the American system is the constant attack ads and the fact that huge money is involved. In Britain, money is much less of an issue, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think that money alone should determine the outcome of elections. I'm not saying it does, because Trump spent less than Hillary did, but nevertheless, in the American system, there's a fortune spent on just attack ads, and that to me is very. I'm not saying we don't have attack ads here in a sense, but here it's more party political broadcasts, which are more about promoting one's own party. Certainly, they will attack other parties, but it's just a slightly different format, and it's not so personalised. It's more about the parties as opposed to individuals. Anyway, I wonder how it is in other presidential systems. I wonder if the French, for example, have a similar transition period and inauguration. I think they do, but it's not as long as the American system. Okay, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.